Tonight, the Supreme Court has shaken the foundations of American economic policy and presidential power. In a landmark ruling, the court redefined the balance of power between Congress and the president over trade tariffs. This isn't just about legal arguments, it's about your job, the prices you pay, and America's place in the global economy. The decision's ripple effects will reach from Pennsylvania steel mills to tech factories in Shenzhen. The court has redrawn the lines of authority, answering a question simmering for years. How much power should the president have to reshape the economy alone? We'll break down what the court decided, why it matters, and what it means for you. Stay with us as we unpack this historic decision. To truly understand the significance of today's Supreme Court ruling, we need to take a step back and look at the events that led us here. The story is rooted in a complex mix of law, politics, and global economics. Let's revisit the origins of this legal battle, tracing how a decades-old law became the center of a modern constitutional debate. In 2018, President Donald Trump invoked Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. He cited national security concerns as the reason for imposing steep tariffs on imported steel and aluminum. This move was both bold and controversial, as it marked one of the most significant uses of presidential trade authority in recent history. Section 232 is a product of the Cold War era, designed to give the president the power to act swiftly if foreign imports were seen as a threat to America's national security. At the time, the law was intended to protect critical industries vital to defense, but the 2018 tariffs set off a chain reaction. They sparked a global trade war, disrupting international supply chains and pitting different sectors of the U.S. economy against each other. American manufacturers suddenly faced soaring costs for raw materials, making it harder to compete both at home and abroad. Meanwhile, U.S. farmers were hit hard by retaliatory tariffs from other countries. Their exports dropped, and many struggled to stay afloat as foreign markets closed their doors to American goods. Across the country, businesses large and small faced mounting uncertainty. Some companies delayed investments, others laid off workers, and the overall economic outlook became clouded by unpredictability. It wasn't long before legal challenges emerged. Critics argued that the president was overreaching, using national security as a catch-all justification for sweeping trade actions that should have required more oversight. Many contended that the Constitution gives Congress, not the president, the authority to regulate foreign commerce and set tariffs. They claimed that allowing the executive branch such broad power undermined the checks and balances at the heart of American democracy. These lawsuits set the stage for a high-stakes constitutional showdown, raising fundamental questions about the separation of powers and the limits of presidential authority. At the center of it all was a single, crucial question. Did the president have too much unchecked power to reshape U.S. trade policy on his own, or should Congress have a greater say? Now, after years of legal wrangling and national debate, that question has finally reached the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court. The Trump tariffs, announced in 2018, quickly ignited a firestorm of controversy and set off a wave of legal challenges that would stretch across the country for years. Businesses, trade groups, and legal experts all questioned whether the president had overstepped his authority, and the issue soon found its way into courtrooms from coast to coast. Plaintiffs, including major steel importers and industry associations, argued that Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 handed the president powers that the Constitution reserved for Congress alone. They claimed this law allowed the executive branch to bypass the checks and balances that are fundamental to American democracy, effectively letting one person make sweeping decisions about the nation's economy. The government, on the other hand, insisted that Congress had deliberately granted the president broad discretion to act in the name of national security. They argued that in a rapidly changing world, the executive needed flexibility to respond to threats that could harm the country's industrial base or military readiness. In the lower courts, judges mostly sided with the government. They pointed to a long tradition of deferring to the executive branch on matters of foreign policy and national defense, especially when Congress had explicitly delegated such authority. But the challengers refused to back down. They warned that if left unchecked, this kind of power could erode the separation of powers and set a dangerous precedent for future presidents, regardless of party. Their arguments drew support from constitutional scholars and lawmakers concerned about the balance of power. In late 2024, after years of legal wrangling and mounting public debate, the Supreme Court agreed to hear the pivotal case, American Institute for International Steel versus United States. The nation's highest court would now decide whether the president's authority under Section 232 was too broad. The stakes were enormous. At issue was whether the president could unilaterally impose tariffs on imports simply by invoking a broad and flexible definition of national security, or whether such decisions required more oversight and limits. The justices now faced the challenge of interpreting a 60-year-old law in the context of a globalized, interconnected economy, one where trade policy could have far-reaching consequences for American workers, businesses, and international relations. Their decision would not only determine the fate of the Trump tariffs, but also reshape the balance of power in Washington for years to come, setting a precedent for how much authority future presidents could wield over the nation's economic destiny. On September 18, 2025, the Supreme Court delivered a landmark decision that would have far-reaching implications for the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches of the United States government. The case, American Institute for International Steel versus United States, had been closely watched by legal experts, business leaders, and policymakers alike, as it challenged the president's authority to impose tariffs under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. In a 6-3 ruling, the court sided with the American Institute for International Steel, significantly curbing presidential power under Section 232. The majority opinion sent a clear message: the president cannot unilaterally impose tariffs under the guise of national security without meeting a much stricter standard of justification. The majority, led by Chief Justice Roberts, established a new, more rigorous test for future tariffs. According to the court, any tariffs imposed under Section 232 must have a direct and proximate link to national defense, not just a vague or speculative connection. This means that the government must now provide concrete evidence that the tariffs are necessary to protect the country's security interests. Economic concerns alone, such as protecting domestic industries from foreign competition or addressing trade imbalances, are no longer sufficient grounds for imposing tariffs under this law. The court made it clear that economic arguments, while important, cannot override the constitutional separation of powers. The court found that the original justification for the 2018 tariffs on steel and aluminum was too broad and lacked a clear, direct connection to national defense. The majority opinion criticized the executive branch for stretching the definition of national security to cover almost any economic issue, warning that such an approach undermines the role of Congress in regulating trade. This ruling does not erase Section 232 from the books, but it does set a much higher bar for future presidential actions. Any new tariffs must now be justified with specific, credible evidence linking them to national defense and not simply to economic policy goals. As a result, lower courts are now required to reconsider the legality of existing tariffs that were imposed under the old, broader interpretation of Section 232. This could lead to the removal or revision of many tariffs currently in place, affecting a wide range of industries and international trade relationships. The decision is widely seen as a major victory for American businesses, which have long argued that broad tariffs hurt their competitiveness and increase costs. It also represents a reassertion of congressional authority over trade policy, reinforcing the idea that such significant decisions should be made by elected representatives, not by executive order alone. As Justice Kavanaugh wrote in his concurring opinion, the Constitution clearly gives Congress, not the President, the power to regulate foreign commerce. This ruling reaffirms that foundational principle, ensuring that future trade policy will be shaped by the legislative process and subject to greater oversight and accountability. The majority opinion united justices across the spectrum, underscoring the constitutional stakes. The court invoked the non-delegation doctrine. Congress can't hand over its core legislative powers. The new direct and proximate test means the president must show a clear link between imports and a real threat to defense. Vague claims about economic harm won't cut it. The ruling returns significant trade authority to Congress. If a president wants broad tariffs for economic reasons, they'll need Congress to act. The separation of powers is reaffirmed. The era of unilateral tariff action is over. In dissent, Justices Thomas, Alito, and Gorsuch warned the court was overreaching. Justice Alito argued national security is broad and evolving, and the president needs flexibility to respond to threats. The dissenters said the new test is too rigid and will limit the president's ability to protect American interests. They cited a long tradition of judicial deference to the executive in foreign affairs. Justice Gorsuch added, if Congress gave too much power, it should fix the law, not the court. The dissent frames the ruling as judicial activism that could weaken America's global position. The debate over executive power versus judicial oversight is far from settled. The Supreme Court's decision will have real economic effects. The most immediate impact: potential removal of tariffs that raised prices on goods using steel and aluminum. Manufacturers could see costs drop, possibly lowering prices for cars, appliances, and more. This could boost investment and hiring in affected industries. But U.S. steel and aluminum producers may face renewed foreign competition and job losses. The debate over tariffs' impact on the economy will intensify. The ruling brings more predictability for businesses, reducing the risk of sudden unilateral tariffs. Trade disputes will now require congressional action or negotiation, not just executive orders. The result, a more stable but slower trade policy process. The political impact is as profound as the economic one. The ruling forces Congress to reclaim its constitutional role in trade policy. Presidents can no longer impose broad tariffs alone; they'll need congressional approval. This shift constrains the America First strategy and demands a new approach to trade. Congress now faces tough choices, balancing competing interests across industries and regions. Lawmakers must take responsibility for trade policy, not just criticize from the sidelines. The decision could improve relations with allies, who saw the tariffs as aggressive. It signals a return to a more rules-based, predictable trade system. But it may also reduce U.S. leverage in tough negotiations with rivals like China. The balance of power in Washington and the world has shifted. This Supreme Court decision is just the beginning. Lower courts will now apply the new test, likely dismantling the tariffs that shaped trade for years. Congress must now step up and define America's trade policy for the 21st century. The challenge: update old laws, balance flexibility with oversight, and move beyond gridlock. For citizens, this is a reminder of the importance of checks and balances. The power to shape the economy is shared, not held by one person. The future of American trade policy is being written now. Stay informed, stay engaged. The story affects us all.